I've been putting together a Deathguard army for 5 or 6 or it's been a long time. And in that time, I have darn close to 2,000 points of Deathguard. Honestly, I've got 2,000 points, it's just in a bunch of weird stuff, like characters, titans, and vehicles. And so it's time to fill in the cracks and get this army playable. Starting with another character, and that is Typhus, the Traveler. Although not physically, Typhus is kind of bigger and badder than Mortarion. Where Mortarion is sort of the reluctant prince of Nurgle, Typhus is in it to win it. He is lost in the sauce of plague and pestilence, and he's not gonna stop until the entire universe is dead, but still shambling around as zombies. I've got a Typhus right here, and the model's fine, it's pretty good, but I can think of a couple of ways that I can make it better. Typhus is Deathguard named Terminator character. He's a big ol' plague boy, and this kit is pretty clean. Just a few mold lines to take care of. One trick for getting into the hard to reach spots is to clip the end of a standing twig to make it narrower so it can get in between the details. Then for spots the standing twig can't do, like the seam running along all these bandages on his axe, this is where the hobby knife comes in. Applying almost no pressure, I just drag the blade perpendicular over the plastic. I'm almost rubbing off the little lip of the mold line. Then to make the seam absolutely vanish, I take my plastic glue brush applicator and I wipe all the liquid back into the bottle so it's just a little bit damp. Then I run this over the seam. This melts the plastic a little and perfectly gets rid of the seam. I've got all my bits and I want to dry fit everything to see what options I have for altering him. He's pretty monopose, all the bits nest into one another, so there isn't much I can do to change the pose without doing some crazy green stuff surgery. I don't think I need to though, his pose is pretty nice. I think just his hands are where I want to make some changes. His big ol' axe held aloft makes it look kinda weightless. I think it'll look better flipped, with an open hand on his right and his axe in his left. This will be tough, but doable. I found this arm holding a thing from the Age of Sigmar Magakin and Nurgle Puscoil Blightlords kit. This hand is a little bit smaller than Typhus's, but this is as good as I'm gonna get for a plague hand holding onto a wrap weapon handle. I started off by clipping off Typhus's hand and then dremeling it smooth. I don't know how much of the handle I'll be able to keep, so I want to save as much material as I can to have enough to work with. Holding them side by side, I think my best bet will be to replace the whole section. I clipped off all the spear shaft that I don't need, so I have the exact amount of handle I need. Then I clipped Typhus's axe in half, removing this whole section. This was pretty nerve-wracking because I can't screw it up. I've only got one of these axes. Now I have 3 pieces that I need to link together, and to get a good connection, I'll have to pin these. They're too small for the 1mm brass rod I like to use, so I decided to use some sewing pins. These are 0.7mm in diameter. I used the point of this Dremel reaming bit to poke a locator hole that my drill bit can find. Then I took a 0.7mm drill bit into my hobby drill and I very carefully drilled holes through all 3 pieces. I didn't go all the way through the shaft with the hand on it, I instead drilled it from both sides, then I stuck in my pins. I clipped these pins as long as I could and then carefully slid the ends into place. My holes are slightly smaller than my pins, so it took some force and wiggling to get them on there perfectly. After some trial and error, it's done, and looking seamless. Now I can clip off the old Magakin arm and get it ready to go onto Typhus's wrist. I used my Dremel to smooth and flatten his wrist so I could plastic glue onto his stump. I stuck it in place and now it's perfect. No one would ever know this isn't how the kit comes. I think Typhus's blade Liqerise, which is a fantastic melee weapon that kills on average 3 or 4 Space Marines. I think it looks bigger and heavier in his left hand, and then for his right hand, I'm reserving that for his ranged attack. He doesn't actually have a gun on his profile, but he is a psyker, and the psychic ability he's able to cast is Gun. Typhus can shoot d6 mortal wounds at whatever he wants within 18 inches, and this is typically represented by the bugs pouring out of his smokestacks, but I want to try to work it all into this right hand. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to try. Now I need to find a Space Marine right hand. I dug through my bits bin, and pro tip, if you're converting a Space Marine, make sure the pose you need has an open left hand. I had dozens of options for open left hands, but only one singular piece for a right. Luckily I do have it though, so this will do the trick. I made myself up a batch of Greenaput, which is Milliput and green stuff mixed together. Then I made a little ball and I shoved it into his wrist to fill in the gap and bump out his wrist just a little bit. I used my silicone sculpting tools to pat this down and round out the edges, and then I stuck down his little hand with a dollop of super glue. Now his hand is triumphantly casting its spell. I want to attach the spells to his back. He's got a bunch of smoke and flies that pour out of his smokestacks. I feel like when his axe is in his right hand, it overshadows these bits, but framed in his open hand, they look much more impressive. That's my Herald of Nurgle, and now he needs a base. I took a 50mm base and I laid on some ultra thin super glue. Then I stuck down some thick 1/2 inch cork. By the way, we sell this cork on EonsOfBattle.com. I used my fingers to rip this up and I added on a second tier of cork. Typhus does have a leg up on a tactical rock pose, so I want to make sure that I nail this with the shape of his base. I used a saw to carve up the rock on an angle, and once I had it about right, I drilled some 1mm holes up into his legs and inserted some brass rods. Then I stabbed him back down into the cork. These pins reach all the way through the cork into the plastic, so his connection is very strong. That's my Typhus on his ultimate tactical rock. Now to give it some plague texture. I used some desert sand texture paste that has a thicker grit to it to fill in where the cork meets the plastic base. Then I switched some Vallejo industrial mud, which has some finer particles, to give everywhere else some grit. Now to make it gross, I took some Elmer's glue and I laid this down on the base in patches. Drip an ultra thin super glue right on top of it. The super glue makes the surface of the white glue dry and wrinkle instantly, making some ugly scabby looking shapes. Then I brushed on some more wood glue and I sprinkled on some sand for some added texture. To make my base even more sickly, I took some dirty down snot, a thick gel-like goo, and I touched this to the rock and stretched it all over the base. Kinda like a spider web. A thick, meaty spider web. Once that was dry, my base was a mess of different materials, but after a black prime, it all looked perfect. Next, I hit him with a white ink from above and a zenithal prime, and then I sprayed him with a satin varnish to protect this ink layer. Typhus is a really powerful character, and he has some really interesting attachment opportunities. To keep him cheap, a squad of Blightlord Terminators, a 3-man squad of Blightlord Terminators, in him is 215 points, and the Terminators don't do a whole lot of damage output, both in melee and at range. They do okay, but it's not gonna super overcharge the squad, but it does keep them nice and cheap and nice and protected with those 3 Terminator bodies. But speaking of 3 Terminator bodies, Death Shroud Terminators are also an attachment option, and that is a really, really powerful unit. 260 points for the privilege, but it's probably worth it for the crazy melee output of Death Shroud Terminators and a fairly respectable ranged output. Now it makes sense that the Terminator character can attach to the Terminator flavors in Deathguard, but he has one more attachment opportunity that is the one that I'm really excited to try out, and that is attaching him to a squad of Poxwalkers. The most powerful character in the Deathguard can attach to the lowliest little unit, the Plague Zombies. Poxwalkers are kinda nothing. They're single bodies with no save other than a 5-up feel no pain, but you attach them to a 20 brick of those guys, and then they can use their zombie ability. If they kill something in close combat, if they kill a model, then I can return a slain Poxwalker to the squad. And this ability can trigger on Typhus's ranged weapon. They might not have the raw survivability of Terminators, but with this guy attached and a 5-up feel no pain on top of that, they can get pretty darn close to a similar level of tankiness. It's a very weird little unit that I am dying to try out. Typhus and his Plague Boys. And now Typhus needs to get a little paint on him so I can try it out. To paint my Deathguard army, I always use the same paints. This is a paint set from a now discontinued line of paints, and these are the only colors I've been using for my Deathguard army. They aren't better than other paints, they're just the ones that I've used, and I've continued to only use them ever since. There is black and white. I do swap to other brands for this. I used up the black and white from the set a long time ago. Then there is a piggy pink color, a mid-tone gray, a very rusty red-brown, a dark ochre yellow, a transparent blue, and a transparent green. These are the only colors that I let touch my Deathguard, and it's this palette and the way I use it that makes my Deathguard look good. I started out slathering on my colors randomly. I took my transparent green and I just put this on wherever it felt right. He ended up being about half green, split right down the middle. Then I took yellow and I did the same thing, laying this on just wherever. I'm focusing on the armor for now. I took my reddish brown color and I slumber this all over his back. It'll be hard to spot because of the bugs, but it's back there. And I put a little bit of this onto the recesses on his front too. Then I mix my black, brown, and yellow together into a dirty gray and I put this over the remaining decorations. His loincloth, tubes, and his Nurgly friend. This is how all my Deathguards start, just a random patchwork of colors, and it's my job to make them feel purposeful and finished. I used my blue color to darken the trim in the recesses of his green leg, and I used my yellow color to force in some highlights on the front of his leg and on his big cloven toe. I also used this yellow to edge highlight some of the details that are spilling over from his green onto his yellow, and I hit all of the trim. Then I came back with my green color super watered down and I glazed this over the work I just did, tinted and blend my colors together. The green stuff is looking good. I focused on the knee, which is now just brown. I decided to bring in the yellow to base coat this and shift it warmer than the surrounding armor. And I mixed in some white paint to make a brighter color to edge highlight with. Now for some rust. Luckily my palette has some rusty rust color, so I took this paint and I thinned it down until it was flowy like water, and I dripped this into all the cracks and dents in his green armor, and I put it onto his loincloth. Since I used all my colors everywhere on the model, no matter what is on my brush currently, I could put it anywhere on the mini. Wherever it feels right, I'll just put down a color. Every inch of the mini gets some attention, and this is what makes my abstract paint job feel correct. With the green leg done, I transitioned to the yellow side, starting with his belly, and moving down the mini. I mixed some white paint into the yellow and I started highlighting using my rusty brown in the recesses to create some shadows. Then to further shade the yellow, I mixed some brown and green to get a dark sludge color and I glazed this into the darkest recesses and the gaps of his armor. I used some more glazes of rusty brown and pure yellow to bring back some of the vibrancy. I'm liking the yellow, but it's looking too clean. Nothing a little green can't fix. I used the green paint as a glaze and over the yellow it looks much warmer and darker than it did over the white zenithal. I'm happy with the yellow, but now the green is looking a little bland. For his left hand, I mixed white into my green and I started edge highlighting, working a few layers to edge highlight all the details, and then I threw a little bit of yellow over top to bring in some of that warmth into the cold region. Then I pin shaded my rusty brown color into the recesses. My Deathguard recipe is so different to any other painting I do, and I feel like I've learned a lot. Since there aren't rules, like red goes here, blue goes over there, but instead I just feel out the paint job. I have to think about value and color, because those are the only tools I have to work with. It's almost like I was painting with black and white glasses on. The colors don't really matter, it's all just about value. For the nurgling, Deathguard Space Marines call these Little Lords. I use my Picky Pink to paint in his muscles and fat folds. Then I mix some red into this pink to make a sickly orange color for the shadows. Then I mixed in more and more white paint to make it brighter and brighter as I reapplied my highlights over and over until he's nice and bright, and maybe just a little shiny. I picked out his tongue in blue and then gave him little white teeth. Then for his eyes, these got dotted with white and then a wash with green. And you know what else gets a wash with green? That's right, EonsOfBattle.com. Over there, we're all restocked with our excellent hobby goodies: Gamer Grass Tufts, Greytide Studio Bits for your Space Marines, Army Painter paints, brushes, basing cork, ultra thin and ultra thick super glue, and we've got terrain. It's the best way to support us doing what we do by getting a membership. Each month, members get a credit good for a one terrain pack I've ever made or the brand new one. This June, we have created the Ramshackle Bits pack. This set is full of improvised armor to enhance your vehicles, with massive treads, extra armor, rotating cannons, machine gun turrets, and little goblin gunners, including a bunch of little goblins to help keep all of this upgraded equipment running smoothly. Don't let the shoddy construction fool you, these bits are still plenty lethal, able to sling lead and crush foes under tread. This set also includes a series of basing bits to litter the wasteland of your battlefield. This set was designed by us and is available at EonsOfBattle.com. He's coming along swimmingly. I would really love to paint some more Deathguard Terminators. They're a wonderful canvas for this weird style. From the base coat, his head got green, and I really like how weird it looks, so I decided to keep it. Putting on some shadows of transparent blue and then highlights of light blue-green until I was finished off with his eyes, which got white paint and then a glaze of yellow. That's a ton of the Traveler all done. In Warhammer 40,000, the Deathguard are very clearly the most dangerous Chaos faction. All of the other Chaos factions are bad, but these guys are as bad as those guys with supernatural plagues. Like, how do you possibly fight against that? It's so overpowered. They've got all the benefits of regular Chaos Space Marines, where they're perfect at shooting and fighting, but then also, just being anywhere near these guys is actively turning you into a soup. Little Typhus here gets his own personal plague, the Destroyer Hive, and just the ability to utilize supernatural plagues does seem unreasonably overpowered, even by 40k standards. Now, it does seem like these illnesses fight fair. If you're winning against the Deathguard, it seems like you're less susceptible to these plagues, and if you're losing against the Deathguard, then you're more susceptible, which is just kind of a funny way that Warhammer balances itself. It's kind of like how the Tyrannid could win battles by blotting out the sun, or eating the atmosphere, but they don't do that. Instead, they grow little machine gun hands and they fight fair. In the world of Warhammer 40,000, you can beat illness with a bolter. My little plague spewer is coming along nicely, and now it is time for all those weapons. For all the flies on his back, I'm thinking less color. He's already so colorful, if I want these to stand out, they'll have to be desaturated. I started out mixing up a gray paint and I glazed this over everything. Then while it was still wet, I threw on a little bit of green paint over his lower clumps of smoke and flies. Then I took white paint and I started glazing on some highlights on the round volumes in his smoke. This took a bit to find all the little bits of exposed smoke and do a few layers of highlighting to work these up to pure white. Then I mixed black and blue together into a wash and I glazed this over the bodies of all the flies to make them dark comparable to the smoke. After that, I took my blue-green and I glazed this over the wings of the flies. Then I took my rusty red color, mixed in a little bit of black to darken it, and I dripped this right into the center of each fly, so it flowed into their recesses, outlining my fly's parts. I dotted all the eyes in yellow, and that's the Destroyer Hive done. Now for his Man Reaper scythe. I mixed my gray with a little bit of blue and I glazed this over the head of the weapon. Once that was dry, I slobbered a little bit of green here and there to start adding some color to it. I took my almost white blue and I edge highlighted the scythe, painting a little white stripe right up the length. Then I took a sharp brush and I painted on a million little streaks coming up from the business end of the blade. This weapon is at the same time completely dull and decayed, and yet somehow supernaturally sharp. I used my rusty red color to glaze into all the pockmarks around the rivets. Then for the wraps, these were already a dark brown, so I began highlighting them with a mix of yellow and red. Then some finer highlights with just my yellow color to make these stand out. That's Typhus, and now onto the fun that ends all of my Deathguard paint jobs, turning my mess of a palette into a base color. I grabbed some of the colors that I had left, yellow, red, and black, and I mixed these together into a yucky brown and I slobbered this all over the ground. Then while I was wet, I mixed up a greenish concoction and I dripped this onto the ground, letting it flow where it wanted. I took more colors, like my reds and greens, and I dabbed these onto the earth to tint them further. Then a nice unhealthy slobber of yellow to see what that'll do. A few extra swipes of green, then a little thin down black, especially around the edges to darken them. Once this gross mix was dry, I did a little dry brushing of my yellow color to bring out the texture of the sand and sticky goo, and Typhus is ready for the rim of the base to get a couple coats of gloss black paint. Typhus the Traveler, the snotty tissue of Nurgle. I really like how this guy turned out. I don't see a lot of people gluing the flies to his back, which kind of makes sense. You don't get to see any of his back, and it's really hard to paint, but I think it looks pretty darn snazzy. He is patient zero for the Destroyer Hive virus. It just took a couple of little alterations to get this guy perfect. I really like that hand up in the air. He's the Herald of Nurgle, and he's doing some heralding. Now that I've got this guy all painted up, my Deathguard army is nearing completion. I got another 10 Deathguard to paint, I got 10 Poxwalkers, and I got one more Rhino to do, and then I will be playing with my 2,000 point Deathguard list. Just in time for 11th edition. We'll see if I get it done before that. Probably not, but soon. I have been stumbling my way to a Deathguard army for a long time now, and the end is in sight. Thanks for watching.